Now, when you think of David, obvious things come to mind. Goliath, as we saw earlier. I'm sure Bathsheba comes in many of the men's minds. What about David being the author of the Psalms? But in my research for this talk, I completed 35 pages and over 8,000 words of facts. So my dilemma was first to reduce it and make it into two talks of, say, about 10 pages. David's life is another rise and fall occasion where God-given gifts are used and abused for self-glory and satisfaction. But whereas Saul didn't acknowledge his failures, David did. So over the next 2 Sundays, you won't necessarily get a sermon, but more of a biography of David and his timeline. So, when was David born? When was he around? Would it surprise you to know that it was over 1,000 years before Jesus? If we want to be accurate, it's about 1,040 years. And we first find the genealogy of David in Ruth chapter 4. He is the direct descendant of Judah, Perez, Hezron, Ram, Abinadab, Nashon, Salmon, Boaz, well, that's a name you might remember, the husband of Ruth, Obed, the son of Boaz and Ruth, and Jesse, his father. When God determined to reject Saul as the king of Israel, he sent Saul with oil to anoint another. As we saw, one of the sons of Jesse at Bethlehem. When Saul arrived at Jesse's home, he had the sons of Jesse brought forward one by one. Now Samuel favored Eliab, the eldest, but God showed him that he should not look at the outside, but look at the heart for truly kingdom qualities. I'm breaking away from my text here because during the week, one of our pantry members, we hadn't seen him. He's a traveler, lovely chap. We hadn't seen him for quite a few months, and he came to me and he said, "Barry, lovely to see you." And I said, "Lovely to see you too, Stig." And he greeted me with a hug. Now, being left-handed, I always go to the right side and go to the wrong side. And he stopped me and said, "Barry, no, go to the left side, heart to heart." That really touched me, that he wanted my heart to be near his heart. Stig is a pagan, he's an interesting character, but a lovely chap. But you tell me where else you can interact with pagans in a church, but I'm digressing. So God passed by the 7 of these sons of Jesse until the youngest, David, remained. David was keeping the sheep of his father, and Jesse did not consider it important to bring him before Samuel. He was described as ruddy and handsome. Well, at least I've got one of the two. When Samuel insisted and David was brought before him, God indicated that this was his choice. David was anointed that day, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily. In the meantime, God's Spirit departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from God came and troubled him. On the advice of some to call a harpist to soothe him, one young person in the court recommended David as a player of the harp and a mighty man of valor, a man of war and prudent in speech. So Saul sent for David, thus giving him an early opportunity to see and know court life. Jesse sent David with an ass loaded with bread, wine, and a kid. When he arrived before Saul, Saul instantly liked him and made David his arm bearer. Saul sought and received Jesse's permission for David to stand before him. Whenever the evil spirit fell upon Saul, David was there with his harp to soothe him. He no doubt composed many of the Psalms in this period. When the Philistines gathered to do battle with Israel in the valley of Elah, Goliath, the giant of the Philistines, came out and threatened Israel. Jesse, by now, was quite old, and his 3 older sons were fighting with Saul. He sent David to the front to see how they were doing. He sent them corn and bread for the brothers and cheese for their captain. David went, leaving the sheep with the keeper, and found his brothers in the camp. As he was talking with them, Goliath came out and threatened as before. When David heard Goliath's boasting, he was indignant. Eliab was disgusted with David for his interest in these matters and accused David of vain curiosity. But David didn't listen to his brother. The men in the camp told David that Saul had promised to give his daughter, and with great riches, to the slayer of Goliath. David's words of indignation against Goliath reached Saul, and Saul sent for him. When David assured Saul that he would fight Goliath, Saul listened. David related to Saul how he had cared for his sheep and protected them against a lion and a bear. But he gave all the glory to God for the victory over the wild beasts. He confessed that he believed that the same God would now deliver him from Goliath. Saul was convinced and set him out to face the giant. Now, David rejected the use of Saul's armor, probably because it was too big for him and too heavy. And as we know, he used a single stone. When Goliath saw this boy, he ridiculed and threatened him. David, not being afraid, affirmed his faith in God. He knew that God would give him the victory so that all might know that there is a God in Israel, and that God's people might know that God does not save by sword or spear, but by his own strength. David ran to meet Goliath and killed him with the first stone. He then cut off Goliath's head with Goliath's own sword. David remained in Goliath's court, in Saul's court, and a great friendship thrived between him and his son Jonathan. The two made a covenant, and Jonathan sealed it by giving David his robe, his sword, his bow, and girdle. Now David behaved wisely before Saul, and the people were set over all Saul's men. But what happened was, women in particular, praised David more than they did Saul. And Saul became jealous and saw his throne threatened. He no longer trusted David. Soon Saul tried to kill David, and David fled. Saul's fear of David increased, since it was evident that God was with David, but no longer with Saul. He demoted David to captain over 1,000 men, but still David conducted himself wisely, and God was with him. This troubled Saul even more, for now Israel and Judah loved David. Though Saul offered Merab, his eldest daughter, to David, he did not keep the bargain. She married another. Then Michal, a second daughter, was offered as bait to David to fight the Philistines. David bargained for her for a dowry of 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Saul was hoping that David would get killed in the process. But not only did David get 100 foreskins, but 100 more. And Michal was given to him. Saul understandably feared David even more and now saw him as his enemy. Yet David, acting wisely, grew even more popular. Saul even tried to turn Jonathan, his own son, against David. However, Jonathan warned David to avoid Saul, and at the same time tried to persuade his father that David was going to be king. Now, Saul agreed for a short time, and David was temporarily restored back in court. As soon as war began, David's popularity arose, and Saul again became more jealous. He tried to kill David in his bed when he was sleeping, but Michal helped him escape. David first went to Samuel at Ramah, and together they fled to Naioth. When Saul heard he was hiding there, he sent a force to capture him. These men, sent by Saul, were made helpless when the spirit of prophecy fell on them by Samuel's command. Then he came personally to capture David, and he himself fell under the same power. David now fled from Naioth to Jerusalem to Jonathan. Jonathan found it hard to believe that his father really hated David and promised to find out the truth. The truth was that Saul did hate David. And Jonathan himself was nearly killed by his own father, who was now in a rage. David and Jonathan then made a pact in which Jonathan expressed assurance that David would one day be king. And David promised to protect Jonathan and Jonathan's seed forever. Then David fled. He was now an outlaw and first went to Nob to get help from Ahimelech, the priest. He lied to Ahimelech, not telling the priest that he had fled from Saul. He deceived him to get aid for himself and those with him. His lie later was fatal for Ahimelech. The priest gave him some of the holy bread and Goliath's sword. But Doeg, a servant of Saul, saw it all. David then next fled to the king of Gath. But when he saw he was not welcome there, he feigned madness and escaped. David went to the cave of Adullam, and his family joined him there. Others in distress also came to David. Soon he had a fighting force of 400 men. All who came seemed to be in one mind with David and his cause. From there, David and his men went to Mizpah of Moab, where he left his parents. Gad, the prophet, warned David to leave there and to go to Judah. And thus he came to the forest of Hereth. Meanwhile, Saul heard of David's maneuvers. He complained that his own men did not help him and that they failed to inform him that his own son was working against him. Doeg then volunteered information about the events at Nob. As a result, in his frustration, Saul had all the priests of Nob killed. One son of Ahimelech, Abiathar, escaped with the ephod and joined David. During this time, David took the city of Keilah from the Philistines, and Saul, hearing of this, came to Keilah to capture David. David learned from the people of Keilah that they would betray him, so he fled with some 600 men. He fled to the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph, where he hid in the woods. It was here that he saw Jonathan for the last time. When the Ziphites offered to help Saul capture David, David moved to Maon in the Arabah south of the desert. Saul pursued and nearly caught David. But just as Saul was about to succeed in capturing David, he received word to return and fight off an attack from the Philistines. Next, David fled to En-gedi. Saul took 3,000 men to capture him there, while Saul rested in a cave in which David hid. He was put into David's hands by God. Though David's men urged him to kill the king, he refused, respecting God's anointed. But he did cut Saul's robe. But even that bothered his conscience, that he had done something against God's elect. When Saul had left the cave, David showed from a distance how he had spared the king's life. Now Saul was under great stress and emotion, and he seemed to see his own wrong. And he even confessed that David would be king. However, this change did not last long. At this time, Samuel died and was buried at Ramah, and David went into the wilderness of Haran. There was a citizen of Maon named Nabal, who had great possessions. Nabal was rich, but also mean and evil. David asked Nabal for some help for his men in return for the years his men had protected Nabal's sheep and shepherds. Nabal instead ridiculed David, which infuriated him. David armed his men and started to get revenge on Nabal. In the meantime, Abigail, Nabal's wife, who was lovely and wise, heard of Nabal's folly and went to meet David to make peace. She met him and pleaded for mercy, urging David not to blot his own good name by shedding innocent blood. She expressed confidence that God would bless David. David reacted favorably to her pleas and spared Nabal and his sons, accepting her gift. At this time, Nabal was drunk and unaware of what had happened. The next day, when he had learned the truth, he was stricken and died. David later married Abigail. About the same time, Saul gave Michal, David's wife, to another man. The Ziphites continued to aid Saul by reporting David's whereabouts. Again, Saul took 3,000 men and went after David. This time, David carefully followed Saul's progress by means of his own spies. One evening, as Saul slept, David and Abishai went to the camp where he lay. God had caused a deep sleep to fall on all the camp. David took Saul's spear and water jug, though Abishai urged him to kill his enemy. When David had left the camp, he called to Saul and chided Abner for not guarding his master. Saul, realizing for a second time that David had spared his life, seemed convinced that David had meant him no ill. He returned home and never pursued David again. However, David, distrusting Saul completely now, fled to the Philistines and dwelt at Gath with the king of Achish. Achish was impressed with David and gave him Ziklag as home. David, while pretending to be his friend, raided Philistine towns in the neighborhood. He left no survivors to tell tales. He told Achish that he was raiding the cities of Judah. Now, in this period, many men of Judah and Israel joined David. Even some of Saul's people men of Benjamin. When the Philistines later prepared to war on Israel, Achish wanted to take David to battle with him. But the warlords of the Philistines wisely refused him. David was forced to stay away from this battle. Fortunately, for it was Saul and Jonathan who would die there. When David returned to Ziklag, he and his men discovered that the city had been raided and the families carried away. Bitterly, they followed in pursuit and finally found the Amalekite raiders and destroyed them, recapturing their own families. He sent gifts from the spoils to the elders of Judah to gain their favor. In this battle, a principle was established by David whereby those who fought and those who were guarded, the supply would share alike in the booty they won. So this is part one of David's story. Throughout it, perhaps you can see aspects of your own life when you've followed God and when you've fallen away from him, when you've realized that you were wrong. But that is part of all of our Christian life. We try, we fail, we seek forgiveness, we try, we fail, we seek God's forgiveness. It is our duty to keep following Jesus, to keep following God and his teaching, his commands. And when we do that, we will have God's blessing on our lives and on our family. So next week we will hear a part 2. And it starts off with the death of Saul and Jonathan. Let us pray.